At 14, Elvis Presley stood nervously in front of his music teacher in a modest classroom in Tupelo, Mississippi. The teacher, a middle-aged figure, looked at Elvis with a mix of indifference and skepticism. Elvis, with his messy hair and quiet demeanor, had always been shy about his passion for music. Despite his natural love for singing, he lacked the confidence many other kids his age had. He was often seen as an outsider, not fitting the typical mold of a star in the making. The teacher, looking unimpressed by Elvis's tentative attempts to sing, sighed and shook their head. "You'll never be a singer," they declared, their voice sharp and dismissive. The words stung, echoing in the small room. The other students, some of whom had heard Elvis hum to himself in class, looked on in silence. Some snickered quietly, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. They saw the vulnerable young Elvis, unsure of himself, and believed the teacher's judgment. In that moment, it seemed like Elvis's dream was doomed before it had even begun. Elvis, taken aback by the harsh words, stood still for a moment, his head down. His hands fidgeted nervously with the edges of his desk. For a second, it seemed like the teacher's verdict would define him. But deep inside, there was a flicker of defiance. Though his heart raced and doubt crept in, he was determined to not let the words of one person, one doubter, shatter his passion. Little did anyone know, those words would only fuel the fire inside him to prove that teacher, and everyone who doubted him, wrong. That night, Elvis sat alone in his small room at home, the faint hum of a radio filling the otherwise quiet space. His eyes were fixed on the glowing dial, each turn of the knob bringing a new song that seemed to resonate deep within him. As the music played, Elvis's face reflected both longing and determination. He wasn't just listening, he was imagining himself on the other side of the speakers, the voice everyone was tuning in to hear. Despite his teacher's harsh words still echoing in his mind, Elvis allowed himself to dream. His fingers, though not yet the polished hands of a seasoned musician, moved over an imaginary guitar, strumming gently as he hummed along to the melody. The songs that filled the air seemed to call to him, urging him to believe that something bigger was meant for him. In those quiet moments, away from the world's judgment, Elvis felt his passion for music grow stronger. The feeling was undeniable, the music was in his soul, and it would not be silenced. In his room, surrounded by the modest trappings of everyday life, Elvis held on to the belief that one day, somehow, he would make the world listen. The doubts from his teacher only spurred him to push forward, not out of anger, but because deep down, he knew he was meant for something more than what the small town of Tupelo could offer. He didn't yet know how he would get there, but the radio's songs gave him the courage to keep dreaming, knowing that someday, his voice would be heard. A few years later, Elvis stood backstage at a small community talent show, the bright stage lights casting long shadows across the room. His heart raced with nerves as he gripped his guitar, a simple, worn instrument that had become his constant companion. The audience was a mix of familiar faces from his small town, and the weight of their expectations felt heavy. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but deep down, he knew this was his moment to prove something to himself. As the announcer called his name, Elvis stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. The crowd's chatter died down, their eyes now fixed on him. He stood in the spotlight, feeling the weight of the moment. He strummed a few chords, his fingers trembling slightly, but as the first note left his lips, something changed. His voice, though unsure at first, began to build strength. The more he sang, the more his confidence grew, as if the music was flowing through him, unstoppable. At first, the audience remained quiet, unsure of what to expect. But as Elvis's voice soared with passion, the room began to shift. Heads turned, people leaned forward, and before long, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd. By the time he reached the final note, the entire room was clapping, some even standing. Elvis stood there, overwhelmed by the response, his cheeks flushed with both surprise and pride. For the first time, he truly believed in himself. The teacher's words, once so discouraging, felt distant now. In that moment, Elvis had shown not only his town but himself that he had the talent and the heart to make it. A few years later, Elvis found himself standing in a recording studio in Memphis, Tennessee, the hum of the equipment around him filling the air with anticipation. He was now a teenager, his face more confident, but still carrying the same raw, untamed energy that had driven him from the beginning. The studio was a far cry from the quiet rooms he had once dreamed in. This was the real thing. His fingers nervously brushed over the guitar strings as he prepared to record his first track, a song called "That's All Right." The producer, a seasoned professional, stood off to the side, watching him with a critical eye. The room was quiet as Elvis strummed the opening chords, his voice tentative at first. But as he sang, the room seemed to fill with something electric. The raw emotion in his voice, the uniqueness of his style, was undeniable. The producer leaned in closer to the soundboard, his expression shifting from skepticism to sheer amazement. "This kid," he muttered to himself, his eyes widening as he heard the sound coming from the young singer. "He's got something." Elvis, lost in the music, didn't see the shift in the room. He just kept singing, feeling the rhythm, and letting the music flow through him as it always had. The producer exchanged a look with his colleagues, unable to hide his astonishment. Elvis wasn't just a local talent anymore, he was something special. As the song came to an end, the producer nodded, a smile creeping onto his face. "That's it," he said. "We've got something here." The realization hit. Elvis Presley, the same boy who had once been told he would never be a singer, was on the verge of becoming a star. A few months later, the news of Elvis Presley's rise to stardom had spread like wildfire. His first records had hit the airwaves, and soon his name was being whispered in every corner of the country. One morning, a teacher from Tupelo, the same one who had once dismissed him, stood in front of a newsstand, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine. As he skimmed the headlines, a familiar name caught his eye: Elvis Presley, a new king in rock and roll. The teacher's eyes widened in disbelief as he looked at the cover, where Elvis's face stared back at him, larger than life. The magazine article detailed Elvis's breakthrough success, his rising fame, and the impact he was already having on the music world. The teacher's heart skipped a beat. This was the same young boy he had once ridiculed, the boy he had told would never make it as a singer. And now, Elvis was not just a singer, he was a phenomenon. The teacher stood frozen for a moment, the words on the page blurring as a wave of realization swept over him. How could he have missed it? How could he have dismissed the very spark that had led to this meteoric rise? He shook his head, the weight of his earlier words now sinking in. The world had spoken, and Elvis had proven everyone wrong, including him. With a sigh, the teacher lowered the magazine, staring off into the distance. There was no denying it now, Elvis Presley had become a legend. And all the teacher could do was stand there, speechless, as the boy he once doubted changed the course of music history forever.